Now, on to our generation gap debate, which this week we've had two stories, haven't we, dominating the agenda. We've had Brexit and then we've had the Roald Dahl story. So I'm going to be asking my panellists, is this censorship of literary classics a sign of cultural vandalism? I'm joined by the historian, Dr. David Starkey, who is going to argue, I'm sure, that it is. And I'm also joined by Rebecca Reid, author and broadcaster. We can agree, without being insensitive to your ages, that there is a generation gap here.
Huge.
Fair enough. Now, David, kick us off, because we've now got another story in the Telegraph this morning suggesting that some of Ian Fleming's books are now being edited. And maybe that's right, because it's different to the Dahl situation. There are some racially very dodgy references in there. But as a general rule, should we be censoring children's books?
It depends on the children's book. I mean, remember, you used a word in your introduction, which is the key word, classic. What a classic mean? Most books die. Most books are things... Your books and my books will almost certainly die. They are things of the moment. When you call something a classic, you mean it's worth reprinting, it's worth surviving, because it is an object out there. And it's for you, the reader, to adjust to the classic, not for the classic to adjust to you. That's why we revive the culture of the ancient world, the original classics. It's why you talk about classical music. And again, I think that the really important thing is, do we see books just as another commercial product? You know, we've got bored. I mean, I read a lovely thing that you did about coffee and Diet Coke. Is it simply a question of I prefer coffee to Diet Coke, or I prefer Diet Coke? Is it another consumer product? If a book is just another consumer product, do you know what? It doesn't matter. Depends what you think it is, what its purpose is, what's even the purpose of getting a child to read.
Yes.
I think the difficulty is that a child reader doesn't have full context. When a child reads something, particularly if they don't have parents who are involved, who are there to have discussions with them, there is a sort of loco parentis role from the publisher to make sure that they're able to read that in a safe way. And I'm not a huge believer in safe spaces for adults, but for children, particularly with children without parents to explain, in some ways...
Be realistic. Is a child that doesn't have a parent to explain going to be given a Roald Dahl? No,
absolutely, because they're in the library at school. They are available everywhere.
But that's
a
job.
shops.
But surely, in that case, it's the job of the teacher. The idea that you have a sensitivity reader in loco parentis. I mean, what an absurd notion.
Why is it different if it's a librarian at school or it's a publisher? It's still somebody making a decision about how children should contextualise reading. Ultimately, somebody has to be responsible. The old Enid Blyton books have language in that would be basically illegal to say to somebody now. We have to accept that some books have to be adapted, particularly with racially sensitive language.
Wouldn't it be more honest to say, let's abandon them?
What
all this is about, so you've conceded my case. You're saying a book is simply a product.
Yeah, I fully agree. I do think that.
Well, then in that case, we can abandon the discussion. All that we think, then, reading is a form of child minding. It is no more than giving a child sweets. I think reading is a challenge. I think the reason you're here, and I think the reason I'm here, is that we were once challenged, we were repeatedly challenged in childhood. And the whole point about good children's books like Dahl is that they challenge, that they're not pap, that they're not just Diet Coke. You want to feed your child Diet Coke. You want to feed... You want to feed your child the equivalent of McDonald's. That's exactly what you're saying.
I am not the kind of parent who does that sort of like, oh, she's so amazing, she's reading Aeschylus. That's not me. I think reading should be enjoyable, it should be fun. There is no enormous high-mindedness about it. It should be fun and great.
Do you see any place for challenge? Do you see any place...
I do see a place for challenge as an adult reader. As a child.
Shouldn't a child, above all, be going to a parent and saying, explain? I've been told this is a naughty word. Wouldn't it make much more sense rather than suppressing...
But they haven't been told it's a naughty word.
No. Of course they've been told it's a naughty word.
Let's let Rebecca respond. Yeah. I mean, I think as well, Dr. Starkey makes this point, some of the stuff that was edited out was pretty harmless. You know, I don't understand why it's a problem for children to
be called
see
fat.
depictions of witches wearing wigs and having difficult fingers.
All fairy stories.
Is very complicated.
Okay,
all fairy stories.
Let's let Rebecca in.
You want to
Rebecca in.
abolish everything that's interesting.
Every single fairy story has been changed to make it more appropriate for children with every generation. You do not read, at the moment, you do not currently read children stories where Cinderella sisters cut their toes off with a meat carver, which is exactly what happened in the original
Although
version.
kids love that
All
stuff.
of you. They do. And I think if you have a safe home with parents who can contextualise it, you can absolutely allow them to have some gore and some fear. But you don't know which child is reading it. And realistically, every single one of these stories, that's the oral tradition. Stories change with every
Before I
generation.
bring David back in, on that maxim then, you could be saying to yourself, OK, well, maybe we shouldn't have Cinderella because it might be offensive to kids from blended families. You know, it's got the wicked stepmother and the ugly sister.
People with club feet like me, it's very
that.
difficult to put on a glass slipper. But can we
not read Snow White to my child on a consent basis.
Sorry.
What?
I would absolutely avoid Snow White on the basis that I think kissing a passed out person is completely inappropriate. Or I would read it and have the conversation where I'd be like, just so you know, if you're passed out, people shouldn't try to
Kissing
flog you.
frogs? I mean...
Is the frog consenting?
Rebecca, come on now.
No, but this is real life. People do get snogged when they're asleep.
This is silly and it's pathetic, and you are on the side of the Puritans. You're a new Bowdler. You're a new Paul IV wanting to go and stick fig leaves on statues.
So
Aren't you ashamed of it? Isn't yours a generation which is simply pathetic and frightened and suppressing and puritanical? I thought we
answer that, Charles.
I thought we suppressed Puritanism.
There are so many. I think
You're a Puritan. Your generation
You're a
of
Puritan.
Puritans.
Boring, tedious Puritan.
All right,
there is
let's
a cycle of Puritanism. Some generations are more conservative than others, and that has always been the case. It's moved from generation to generation. However, I would say I'm not being puritanical because I would like children to be able to read stories without absorbing incredibly dangerous messages with no one to unpack it for them.
Define what's incredibly dangerous in, for instance, the twits.
I mean, incredibly dangerous would be overstating it, but in the Twits, there is a whole passage about how if you're a nice person, you will have a nice face and look nice, and if you're a bad person, you'll be ugly. That is a pretty toxic thing to say to children, that people who aren't facially pleasing are inherently bad people. That's not great, is it?
Well, then in that case, just stop reading Dahl.
But they're great books.
Read. What you should be doing, you should be writing exactly like Diet Coke. It wants to be sweet, it wants to be pink, it wants to be absolutely safe, it wants to leave children with no thoughts at all. But a much more interesting question. Are you keen on censorship just for children? Wouldn't you like to see everything censored?
Would you give your child an book to read? Everyone believes in censorship for children. Nobody is saying to children, let's watch Pulp Fiction. Everybody believes on a certain level.
Do they? What about reading the Bible? Right. What about starting...
The Bible is self-fulfilling because it's so boring children don't care.
What about... I think many children have to read it, and many more have to read the Koran. The Koran has got much more shocking things in it than Roald Dahl.
But you're still avoiding my point. You must believe in some form of censorship for children because you wouldn't let a child watch porn, would you?
I'm asking you a serious question.
I was asking you a serious question.
You are wanting to censor little stories by Dahl. What about the things in the Koran? What about the condemnation of homosexuality, of Jews, of Christians? What about the notion of murder in the cause of the faith? Now, do you think children read that? Children are compelled to read that.
Really quick response, because we need
Shouldn't that be censored? Or?
Should it be censored, Rebecca?
I do think that all children who are exposed to religion should be given it in context and should be given it at an age-appropriate moment.
So you want the Koran censored?
I think this has become intellectually dishonest at this point.
We like some intellectual honesty. We also like some good banter from both of you, and it's been brilliant.